This is part 2 of the Wholecloth Patterns Fairmount Bag Sew-Along. Today we'll assemble our bags using all the parts and pieces we prepared in the part 1 video. If you're just beginning to sew your Fairmount bag, you can find the first half of the pattern instructions in the video called Fairmount Bag Sew-Along Part 1. I'll link to that video and the sewing pattern in the notes below the video. I'll be demonstrating the remaining steps by making a view A of the Fairmount bag. If you're making a view B, don't worry, the instructions are the same, so you can still follow along. Now, let's get started. To install the zipper, we're going to begin with the side of the bag that has the interior pocket, and I'm going to position it with the right side facing up. The Fairmount bag uses a 13-inch zipper. This is a pretty elusive zipper size, so there are a couple different things you could do. You could cut down a plastic zipper or use zipper by the yard or zipper tape. This top edge is 14 inches long, so you would need a zipper or a piece of zipper tape that is at least that long to fit the bag. You could also shorten a metal zipper. That's what I've done for this bag, and I'll link to the how to shorten a metal zipper tutorial in the notes below the video. Position the zipper so that the closed pull is on the left side of the bag. As I mentioned when we installed the pocket zipper, I've positioned the zippers on this bag in a way that I think is most comfortable for a right-handed person wearing the bag on their right side. To make the bag more comfortable for wearing on the left side, all you have to do is reverse the zipper. So for today, we're going to have the closed zipper pull on the left side and right side of the zipper up against the right side of the bag. I'm going to align the edge of the zipper with the edge of the bag and pin it in place. Next, I'll sew the zipper, and I'm going to use a 3/8 inch seam allowance and the zipper foot for my sewing machine. I usually start sewing just below the zipper pull and sew the length of the seam, and then I go back to the beginning, open the zipper pull a few inches, and then sew the remainder of the seam. It's best to keep the zipper pull out of the way of your presser foot because it can make a bump in your seam. Next, we'll grade the fabric side of the seam allowance. So I'm going to trim the fabric and the lining side of the seam allowance down to about 1/4 inch, but I'm not going to trim the zipper tape. Here's my graded seam allowance. You can see that the fabric and the lining are a little bit shorter than the zipper tape now. Next, I'm going to press the body of the bag away from the zipper. Now we'll top stitch on the fabric side of the seam about 1/8 inch away from the fold and the whole length of the zipper. Here is the top stitching along the zipper. Now I'm going to repeat all of the zipper installation steps with the other side of the bag. We're ready to attach the strap ends to the bag. I have both of the top strap ends here, and I've already fused the interfacing to the wrong side of each piece. We'll position the fabric with right sides together and align this long edge and the 2 X markings on the strap connector with the X markings on the body of the bag and this short end above the zipper. I usually open the zipper a little bit when I'm doing the end with the pull, just because it gives you a little more flexibility. I'm going to stitch between the X marks and be sure to back stitch at each end. Now with the lining side facing up, I'm going to clip my seam allowance from about 1/8 of an inch from the X mark to this inside corner of the body. And this is just to allow the seam allowance to open up a bit when we attach the bottom of the bag. And I'm going to cut through the lining and the body fabric, but not the strap end fabric. I'm just cutting through this corner to about 1/8 of an inch from my marking. That allows my seam allowance to open up at this pivot point. I'm going to repeat that on the other side of the strap end. I'm going to press the seam allowance and the strap end away from the bag, and then I'm going to top stitch on the strap end about 1/8 of an inch away from this seam. And when I'm top stitching, I want to be sure not to catch the portion of the seam allowance below where we made the clip. So I'm going to hold the sides out of the way while I do the top stitching. And this is what it looks like from the wrong side. Now I'm going to repeat those steps with the other strap end and the other end of the zipper. Both of the strap ends are attached and top stitched. I'm going to set this piece aside while I work on constructing the bottom of the bag. I have the main fabric and the lining fabric for the bottom of the bag. And I'm just going to kind of laminate the two together, line up all the edges, line up the notches. And at this point, you could baste along the long edges of these pieces to hold them together. But I'm just going to pin them loosely to hold them in place while I work on the bottom of the bag. Now we're ready to make the pleat. I usually mark each of the lines for the pleat with a pin so that I know where I'm making the folds. With the main fabric facing up, I'm going to fold the outer markings to meet in the middle at the inner markings. So there will be a fold at each outer pin that aligns with the center pin to make a box pleat. So once I've formed the box pleat, then I'll pin down each side to hold it in place. So here you can see what it looks like on the right side of the fabric, and you can see the box pleat on the wrong side. Once I have the box pleat set up at the edge of the fabric, I like to carry it down into the fabric body a few inches, and then I'm going to pin it again down here. I'm going to press it to hold my folds in place. At this point, I can baste across the top of the pleat. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and I'm going to add the ring loop in the same step. You can absolutely do it in 2 steps if you're more comfortable. I'm going to center the ring loop on the pleat and align these top raw edges, and then I'm going to baste the ring loop to the bottom of the bag at the same time that I'm securing the pleat. I basted the ring loop and the pleat into the bottom of the bag, and I also put in a little extra line of basting where I had it pinned further into the pleat. I just think it makes it a little bit easier to work with, and I'll take this line of basting out when the bag is finished. Now I'm going to repeat the pleat on the other end of the bag bottom. I have the pleats basted into each end of the bottom of the bag. Now I can attach the bottom strap ends. So I have my bottom strap end pieces. I've already fused the interfacing to the wrong side. I'm going to find the side that has the notch, and with right sides together, I'm going to align the notch with the center pleat on the bottom of the bag. I'm going to pin this and then sew across this short edge. Next, I'm going to press the seam allowance and the strap end away from the bottom of the bag, and then I'm going to top stitch on the strap end about 1/8 inch away from the seam. Now I'm going to repeat these steps with the other end of the bag bottom. It can be a little bit tricky to sew through all of these layers of fabric across the top of the ring loop. I usually start in the middle and work my way out to either side so that I'm sewing the seam in 2 sections. I have the assembled bottom of the bag and the assembled body of the bag. Now it's time to put the two together. I usually use clips instead of pins for this because the seam can be kind of bulky. We'll align one long edge of the bottom with the curved edge of the body of the bag. We want to match up the seams at the strap ends and the notches around the curved bottom of the bag. I usually position my ring loop at the opposite side of the closed zipper pool. With everything clipped together, I'm going to sew from end to end using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you're sewing view A like I am, I use the zipper foot and you can feel the piping through the layers of fabric, and I just let the piping be my guide for where to sew. So basically you want to sew as close as you can to the piping. When you're sewing across the seam for the strap ends, you want to make sure you're sewing through the X marking in the fabric. Basically, you just want to make sure that you're catching the fabric on the inside of this V-shaped cut we made into the seam allowance. You want to just catch the fabric at the point of that V. Here I've attached the bottom of the bag to the body of the bag. And full disclosure, I thought I was taking a video of myself sewing it, and actually I just took a picture. It takes a bit of focus to sew this seam because you want to make sure you're staying up against the piping and you're hitting all the points just right. I don't always get this seam perfect the first time, and that's okay. Once I've sewn the seam, I go back and I check on a couple of things. I always check to be sure that I caught the fabric here where we snipped the seam allowance. You want to make sure you didn't sew over the open part of the seam allowance. I'm going to check the other side too. On this one, I did catch a little bit of the opening, so I'm just going to go back and be a little bit more careful at that corner. And I also check to be sure I got close enough to the piping. I'm pretty happy with the way that piping looks, so I'm not going to change anything there. I'm just going to go back and redo that little section of the seam at the strap connector. Now that I'm satisfied with the way this seam is sewn, I'm going to go ahead and attach the other side to the bottom of the bag. Before I do this, I'm going to open the zipper most of the way so I have an opening when I'm ready to turn the bag right side out. Once again, I checked all the tricky points and I'm pretty happy with the way I sewed those seams. So I'm going to move on to applying the seam binding. The first thing I'll do is grade the seam by about 1/8 inch. So I'm just trimming off this outer 1/8 inch to make the seam a little bit shorter. And I'm going to do that on both sides. I'm going to bind this bottom seam from just above the strap end seam on one side of the bag around the bottom to just above the strap end seam on the other side. So basically from here to here and around the bottom. To do that, I'm going to align the edge of this seam allowance with the middle fold of my bias tape. And I usually start in the middle of the bottom and work my way up the sides. I'm just going to sandwich all the layers of the seam between my bias tape, and then I'm going to clip. On the View A bag, you can kind of feel the piping to know where the inside corner of your bias tape should be, and use that as your guide. When I get to the point where I'm ready to end the bias binding, I just cut it off square. Now we're ready to sew the bias binding to the bag. We're going to follow this interior fold around the bag, and we'll top stitch about 1/16 of an inch from the fold on the bias binding. You want to be sure that your bias binding is evenly attached so that when you're sewing, you're also catching the underside of the bias tape. Now I'm going to check the underside of the bias tape to make sure I didn't miss it anywhere. And if I did, I'll just go back and sew that little section of seam. This one is looking pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and repeat those steps on the other side of the bag. Here's my finished bias binding. This is my very favorite step of making this bag. I feel like it just looks so polished and professional, and I love the ability to mix fabrics that you can either reflect it on the outside or keep it a secret for the inside. It's just such a fun little detail. Anyway, now that we have the binding attached, we can move on to our last step, which is attaching the strap. Here I have my strap hardware. I have the length adjuster and the square loop, and the strap that we made earlier. The first thing that I need to do is cut a 2.5 inch piece off one end of the strap. I'm going to thread this short piece of strap through my square loop, line up these raw edges, and then I'm going to baste across the top to hold the loop on this little piece of strap. Here's the square loop basted onto my little piece of strap. Next, I'm going to move on to the long piece of the strap. Next, I'll make a 1/4 inch fold at one end of the strap. And I'm just going to use my iron to press that fold in so it will hold until I'm ready to sew. Now I'm ready to thread my strap onto my length adjuster. With the fold I just made on the strap facing the center bar of my length adjuster, I'm going to thread the strap through one side of the length adjuster, then fold it over the center bar and thread it back down through the other side. And then I'm going to leave about 1 inch of space between this fold in the fabric where it captures the length adjuster and the first fold that I made, so that I have room to stitch across this first fold and secure the length adjuster in this loop of fabric strap. So I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch from this first folded edge. Now I'm ready to combine this with the square loop that we've already assembled. I'm going to thread the square loop onto my strap about 3/4 of the way along, just to give myself a little space between the square loop and the length adjuster so I have room to work. And then as I have it positioned here, you can see the strap comes off the center bar of the length adjuster and goes through my square loop. Then it continues toward the top of the length adjuster. So I want to thread my strap through that upper side of the length adjuster so that it looks like this and makes a loop. And then I'm going to thread it back down through the other side of my length adjuster, like this. And that makes my adjustable strap. Now we just have to attach it to the bag. First, let's establish the right side and the wrong side of the strap. I'm calling the right side of the strap the side that will be away from your body when you're wearing the bag. So it will be this side of the strap where it goes through the length adjuster, and you can see the rectangle of the length adjuster. With my bag still turned wrong side out, I'm going to begin with the end of the strap that has the square loop. I'm going to insert this end of the strap up into the strap end pieces from inside the bag and align this raw edge with this raw edge. And I want the right side of the strap to be touching the right side of the bag, which in this case is this part at the bottom. It's a little bit easier to get this short piece up into the strap connector if you rotate the hardware so that the short side of the rectangle is what you'll be pushing up into the bag. So again, with the right side of my strap touching the right side of the fabric in my bag, I'm going to insert this end up into the strap connector on the side with the open zipper pull, and I'm going to align these raw edges. So here I have the end of my strap that's inside the bag, and I'm just going to align the edges here, and then I'm going to clip it together across this seam. Now I'm going to repeat that with the other end of the strap and this end of the bag. I just want to make sure that I haven't twisted my strap inside the bag, and I'm going to insert it in the other strap end. Now I'm going to line up the raw edges and pin or clip across the opening. Now I'm ready to sew each end of the strap to the bag. At this point, I like to verify that I've installed the strap properly. So I'm just going to turn the bag partially right side out so that I can be sure that I haven't twisted the strap and that the correct side is facing away from my body. So here I can see the strap looks good. So I'm going to go ahead and finish the seams. I'm going to grade the corners of these seams just so there's a little bit less bulk when I turn the bag right side out. I'm going to start at the edge of my seam allowance just above where my bias binding ends, and I'm going to angle this seam in so that it ends just on the seam allowance side at the end of this line of stitching. And I'm going to do that on all four corners. Here's what the graded seam will look like on each end. And now I'm ready to turn the bag right side out. I'm going to turn the strap connectors right side out by pulling out the strap. I'm going to remove this extra line of basting that I put in when I made the pleat. And here is our finished Fairmount bag. Thanks for sewing along with me today. I would love to see what you made. You can share your bag on Instagram by using the Wholecloth Fairmount hashtag. Be sure to check out the links below the video and click subscribe to follow the Wholecloth Patterns sewing channel.